Former President Donald Trump's lawyers say the Supreme Court should not decide now if he can be put on trial for trying to overturn the 2020 election results. That request to the High Court follows the decision by Colorado's High Court to remove Trump from that state's primary ballot, an issue that the justices may have to decide as well. CBS News chief elections and campaign correspondent Barbara Costa is joining us now from outside of the Supreme Court.
Good morning. So often as a political correspondent, I find myself in Iowa or New Hampshire or South Carolina, a little warmer than it is right now here in Washington, D.C. But right now I'm here outside the Supreme Court because this is becoming
9-0. Let that sink in for a second. 9-0. That's every single justice on the Supreme Court. The conservatives Trump appointed, they voted against him. The liberals, they voted against him. Everyone in between, they voted against him. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a split decision where you could argue about judicial philosophy or constitutional interpretation. This was the entire Supreme Court looking at what the Trump administration did and saying, no, you can't do that. You have to fix this, and you have to fix it now. Are you kidding me right now? This is absolutely devastating for the White House. This is the kind of unanimous rebuke that doesn't happen very often. And when it does happen, it means something has gone seriously wrong. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. A man named Kilmar Abrego Garcia was wrongfully deported to El Salvador. And when I say wrongfully, I mean the courts have already established that this deportation should not have happened. This wasn't a case where there was some ambiguity about his status. This wasn't a situation where reasonable people could disagree about whether he should have been removed from the country. The courts looked at the facts and said this was wrong. This man should not have been deported, and the government needs to bring him back. That's what the lower court ordered. Create a plan to return this man who was wrongfully removed from his home and his family. A straightforward order from a federal court telling the administration to fix their mistake and make it right. And what did the Trump administration do? They fought it. They delayed. They made arguments that the Supreme Court unanimously rejected. They dragged their feet and tried every legal maneuver they could think of to avoid having to comply with the court's order.
That big question before the Supreme Court, are presidents above the law? All of it stemming, of course, from former President Donald Trump's claim that, yes, he should have immunity for any crimes he may have committed while in office. It's a case that will affect him, but also every future president of the United States. Jan Crawford was in the court for the argument. She joins us now. Jan, good morning. I heard one of the justices say this is a decision for the ages. What happened there?
Yeah, I mean, they repeatedly, Tony, emphasized that this case is going to go well beyond Donald Trump. And, you know, in today's kind of toxic political environment, the idea of this tit for tat was a real concern for the justices.
And the Supreme Court, all 9 justices, said enough is enough. You have to create a plan. You have to work on bringing this man back. You don't get to just wrongfully deport someone and then shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, too bad, nothing we can do about it now. That's not how the rule of law works. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. When a court tells you to do something, you have to do it, even if you're the president of the United States. But here's where it gets really interesting and really infuriating. After this unanimous ruling came down, Stephen Miller went out and tried to spin it as a victory for Trump. Can you believe that? A 9-0 loss, and Miller is standing at a White House event claiming they won. He completely misrepresented what the ruling actually said. He acted like the Supreme Court had sided with the administration when they had done the exact opposite. And Trump was standing right there, nodding along like everything Miller said was true. It was gaslighting in real time. It was the administration looking at a devastating legal defeat and trying to convince everyone that black is white and up is down and losing unanimously is actually winning. The backlash was immediate and intense. Legal experts pointed out that Miller was flat out lying about what the ruling meant. Journalists who had actually read the decision called out the misrepresentation. It became this perfect example of how the administration operates. When reality doesn't match what they want, they just make up a different reality and hope nobody notices. But people notice. The ruling is public. Anyone can read it. And what it says is crystal clear. The Trump administration has to comply with the lower court's orders. They have to create a plan to remedy this wrongful deportation. They don't get to just ignore it. And get this, the Department of Justice missed the court-ordered deadline for submitting their plan. They were given a deadline by the court to show how they were going to fix this situation and bring Garcia back, and they missed it. Reports indicate that by mid-April, there was serious question about whether any meaningful progress had been made at all. So not only did they lose 9-0, they're apparently not even complying with the ruling they lost. They're just continuing to ignore what the courts tell them to do. That's contempt. That's lawlessness. That's an administration that thinks it's above the law and above the courts and above everything. This matters because it exposes something fundamental about how Trump operates. He doesn't respect the judicial system. He doesn't respect court orders. He doesn't think he has to follow the same rules as everyone else. And when he loses, even when he loses unanimously, he just pretends he won and hopes his supporters believe him instead of their own eyes. It's a pattern we've seen over and over again, and it's dangerous. Because if the president can just ignore court orders, if he can just pretend losses are wins, then what's the point of having courts at all? What's the point of having laws? This is bigger than one wrongfully deported man. This is about whether we still have a functioning legal system in this country. And right now, that question is very much in doubt. All right, let's really dig into what happened here and why it matters so much. Because this case is about more than just one person. It's about the limits of executive power. It's about whether the president has to follow court orders. It's about the rule of law itself. And the Supreme Court, in a rare moment of complete unanimity, drew a line. They said there are limits even for you, even for the President of the United States. And the administration's response to that line has been to basically pretend it doesn't exist. So let's break down exactly what's going on and what it means for everyone. First, let's talk about who Kilmar Albergo Garcia is and how he ended up at the center of this constitutional showdown. Garcia is a man who was living in the United States when immigration authorities detained him and deported him to El Salvador. The problem is, according to the courts, this deportation was wrongful. It shouldn't have happened. There were legal protections that should have applied to him. There were procedures that should have been followed. And the government either ignored those protections and procedures or violated them outright. The result was that a man who should have remained in this country was forcibly removed and sent to a country where he may face serious danger. His family was torn apart. His life was upended. And it happened because the government made a mistake. Or worse, because the government deliberately cut corners in their rush to deport as many people as possible. When this wrongful deportation came to light, Garcia's attorneys took the case to federal court, and the court agreed with them. The judge looked at the facts and said, yes, this deportation was wrongful, and the government needs to create a plan to remedy this situation. That means figuring out how to bring Garcia back to the United States where he belongs. That's what the lower court ordered. It wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. It was simply saying, you made a mistake, now fix it. That's basic accountability. That's what courts are supposed to do. When the government violates someone's rights, they're supposed to order a remedy. They're supposed to make sure the wrong gets corrected. But the Trump administration didn't want to comply. They didn't want to create a plan to bring Garcia back. They didn't want to admit they had made a mistake. So they fought it. They appealed. They made every argument they could think of to avoid having to follow the court's order. They claimed the president has broad authority over immigration. They claimed the courts couldn't tell them what to do. They claimed there were limits on judicial power when it comes to deportation decisions. And the case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. The highest court in the land was going to decide whether the administration had to comply with the lower court's order or whether they could just ignore it. And on April 10th, 2025, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. 9-0. Every single justice agreed. The administration's arguments were rejected. The lower court's order was largely upheld. The government has to create a plan to remedy Garcia's wrongful deportation. This wasn't a liberal decision or a conservative decision. This was a unanimous decision that crossed all ideological lines. Justices who almost never agree with each other agreed on this. Justices who Trump himself appointed agreed on this. There was no dissent. There was no partial concurrence suggesting the majority went too far. It was complete and total agreement that the administration was wrong and had to comply with the court's order. Now, what makes this even more remarkable is the context. This Supreme Court has been very friendly to Trump on a lot of issues. They've given him wins on immigration policy. They've given him wins on executive power. They've been sympathetic to his arguments in ways that previous courts might not have been. So when even this court, even these justices, unanimously reject what the administration is doing, that tells you something. That tells you they went too far. That tells you even justices inclined to support broad executive authority looked at this situation and said, no, there are lines you cannot cross, and you crossed them. The decision demands immediate compliance with the lower court's orders. not eventual compliance, not compliance when they get around to it, immediate compliance. The court was sending a message: stop stalling, stop delaying, stop making excuses, do what you were ordered to do. And that message wasn't just about Garcia, it was about the broader pattern of the administration treating court orders as optional, as suggestions they could ignore when inconvenient. The Supreme Court was saying, that's not how this works. Courts issue orders, and you follow them, period. But then came the spin. 4 days after the ruling, on April 14th, Stephen Miller stood at a White House event and completely misrepresented what the Supreme Court had said. He claimed the ruling was actually a victory for Trump. He suggested the court had sided with the administration's position. He spun a 9-0 loss into some kind of win, and Trump was standing right there, nodding along, acting like everything Miller said was accurate. It was breathtaking in its dishonesty. It was Orwellian. They were literally trying to convince people that the opposite of what happened had happened. The backlash was swift. Legal commentators who actually read the ruling pointed out that Miller was lying. Journalists highlighted the discrepancy between what Miller claimed and what the ruling actually said. It became a story in itself. The administration's willingness to just make things up, even when the truth is easily verifiable. Because anyone can read a Supreme Court opinion. It's public, it's online. You can see for yourself what the justices wrote. And what they wrote was a clear rejection of the administration's position. There's no honest way to spin it as a victory, but Miller tried anyway, and Trump went along with it. And then, as if to prove that they had no intention of actually complying, the Department of Justice missed the court-ordered deadline for submitting a plan. The court said, create a plan to remedy this wrongful deportation, and gave them a deadline, and they missed it. By mid-April, there were serious questions about whether any progress had been made at all. The administration appeared to be simply ignoring the ruling, acting like it didn't apply to them, acting like they could lose 9-0 at the Supreme Court and then just go on doing whatever they wanted anyway. This is constitutional crisis territory. When the executive branch refuses to comply with court orders, that's not normal disagreement between branches of government. That's a breakdown of the rule of law. The courts exist to check executive power. They exist to say you can't do that when the government oversteps. But that only works if the executive branch actually follows court orders. If they can just ignore unfavorable rulings, then the courts have no real power. Then we don't have a system of checks and balances anymore. We have a system where the president does whatever he wants and nobody can stop him. This case also connects to broader concerns about Trump's immigration enforcement. The wrongful deportation of Garcia isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of aggressive enforcement that has swept up people who shouldn't have been targeted. There have been reports of citizens being detained. There have been reports of people with valid legal status being deported. There have been reports of due process being ignored in the rush to meet deportation quotas. Garcia's case made it to the Supreme Court. But how many other wrongful deportations have happened that never got that kind of legal attention? How many other people are sitting in foreign countries right now who were wrongfully removed and have no way to fight back? The ruling also touches on the use of National Guard deployments and other enforcement tactics that the administration has employed. The court's demand for immediate compliance extends to ending unauthorized actions, suggesting that some of what the administration has been doing goes beyond what the law allows. This isn't just about one man anymore. This is about the entire approach the administration has taken to immigration enforcement, an approach that the Supreme Court unanimously has said needs to change. So let's break this down into the key points you need to understand, because this ruling has major implications, not just for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but for executive power and the rule of law more broadly. Here we go. Point number 1. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the Trump administration. This was a unanimous decision. Every single justice, conservative and liberal, agreed that the administration's arguments should be rejected and the lower court's order should be upheld. Unanimous rulings are rare at the Supreme Court, especially on politically charged cases. When all 9 justices agree, it means the losing side's position was indefensible. It means there was no credible legal argument to support what the administration was trying to do. This wasn't a close call or a matter of judicial philosophy. This was the entire court saying you're wrong, full stop. Point number 2, the ruling requires the administration to create a plan to return Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was wrongfully deported, to El Salvador. The lower court found that his deportation should not have happened, that legal protections were violated, that procedures were not followed. The Supreme Court upheld that lower court's order requiring a remedy. This means the administration can't just say, too bad he's gone, nothing we can do. They have to actively work on fixing the mistake they made. They have to figure out how to bring this man back to the country he was wrongfully removed from. Point number 3, Stephen Miller egregiously misrepresented the ruling as a victory for Trump during a White House event on April 14, 2025. While Trump stood there nodding along, Miller claimed the administration had won when they had actually suffered a unanimous defeat. This sparked immediate backlash from legal experts and journalists who pointed out that Miller was simply lying about what the ruling said. It was a striking example of the administration's willingness to claim victory even in the face of obvious defeat, hoping their supporters would believe the spin rather than read the actual decision. Point number 4, the Department of Justice missed the court-ordered deadline for submitting their plan to remedy Garcia's wrongful deportation. Reports indicate that by mid-April, there was serious question about whether any meaningful progress had been made. This suggests the administration may simply be ignoring the ruling despite losing unanimously. If true, this represents a serious constitutional problem. The executive branch is supposed to comply with court orders. When they don't, it undermines the entire system of checks and balances that our government depends on. Point number 5. This ruling exposes cracks in the administration's legal strategy on immigration enforcement. They thought they could argue that courts have limited power over deportation decisions, that the president's authority is essentially unchecked in this area. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected that view. This could affect other immigration cases and other deportations. It establishes that courts can and will order remedies when the government wrongfully removes someone. That's a significant precedent that limits what the administration can get away with. Point number 6. The decision demands immediate compliance with court orders, including ending unauthorized National Guard deployments and other enforcement tactics. The court wasn't just ruling on Garcia's specific situation. They were sending a broader message about the limits of executive power in immigration enforcement. Some of what the administration has been doing apparently exceeds their legal authority, and the courts are saying stop. Now, what does this mean going forward? Well, first, it creates a test of whether this administration will actually follow court orders or whether they'll continue to act like they're above the law. The missed deadline is not a good sign. If they continue to ignore the ruling, there could be contempt proceedings. There could be escalating confrontations between the judicial and executive branches. We could be heading toward a genuine constitutional crisis if the administration simply refuses to do what the Supreme Court unanimously told them to do. Second, this ruling provides ammunition for critics who argue the administration has been reckless and lawless in its immigration enforcement. A 9-0 Supreme Court loss is hard to spin as anything other than a devastating rebuke. Democrats will use this in the midterm campaigns. They'll point to it as evidence that Trump doesn't respect the rule of law. They'll argue that even his own Supreme Court appointees rejected his overreach. It's a powerful talking point because it's completely true and easily verified. Third, it raises serious questions about how many other wrongful deportations have occurred that never got Supreme Court review. Garcia's case made it all the way to the highest court, but he's probably not the only person who was wrongfully removed. How many others are out there? How many families have been torn apart by deportations that shouldn't have happened? This ruling suggests the administration's aggressive enforcement has crossed legal lines, and Garcia is just the case we know about. Fourth, the administration's response to the ruling, misrepresenting it as a victory and apparently ignoring compliance deadlines, shows how they operate when they lose. They don't accept defeat gracefully. They don't acknowledge mistakes. They lie about what happened and hope their supporters believe the lie. This pattern is dangerous because it erodes trust in institutions and in the concept of objective truth. When the White House says a 9-0 loss is actually a win, they're counting on people not to check for themselves. Fifth, this case is part of a broader pattern of confrontation between Trump and the courts. We've seen it in other areas too. The firing of officials with legal protections, the use of emergency powers Congress didn't authorize, the defiance of congressional oversight. The courts keep pushing back, the administration keeps testing the limits. And the question is whether the judicial system can actually hold a determined president accountable when he simply refuses to accept its authority. And here's the bigger picture. The rule of law depends on everyone following the same rules, including the president. Courts exist to say you can't do that when the government oversteps. But court orders only mean something if the executive branch follows them. If the president can just ignore rulings he doesn't like, even unanimous rulings from the Supreme Court, then we don't really have a functioning legal system anymore. We have a system where power is the only thing that matters, and legal constraints are just words on paper. That's what's at stake in how the administration responds to this ruling. Not just whether one wrongfully deported man gets to come home, though that matters too. It's about whether America still operates under the rule of law, or whether we've become something else, something where the president can do whatever he wants, and nobody, not even non-Supreme Court justices, can stop him. The Garcia case is a test, and so far the administration is failing that test. They're lying about what the ruling said. They're missing compliance deadlines. They're acting like they don't have to follow orders they disagree with. If that continues, if they get away with it, then the precedent is set. Future presidents will know they can ignore court orders too. The system will be permanently weakened. This is why this story matters. This is why a case about one man's wrongful deportation has implications for everyone, because it's really about whether the president is above the law. And right now, the Trump administration is acting like the answer is yes. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure those notifications are on, because we're going to be tracking whether the administration actually complies with this ruling or whether they continue to defy it. Every development matters. Every deadline matters. Every statement matters. And we're going to be here covering all of it, because this is about the fundamental nature of American government, and you deserve to know the truth about what's happening. Stay tuned.